Okay, up and recording, almost on time. I was talking a little bit too much, but you guys were ready. I just, can't shut up a rabbi. All right, so we are beginning Bava Batra. We are beginning a new Masechet of Mishnah. This is from the Seder, from the order of Nizikin, of damages. Originally, the three Bavas were all one volume, and they were like the largest single section in the entire part of the Mishnah and then the Talmud. It's a little hard to carry around only one volume, though, because it's huge. And so they were divided into three different Bavas, three different gates, so that we could do it. And this is Bava Batra. This is the last gate. This is the third section. Between all of them, not exactly. I mean, they all fit together very well as being, civil commercial law. But as far as why one would be in one and one would be the other, I mean, they all intermingle in terms of the principles needed to understand. So I haven't heard a good explanation of why one was put one was put the other, but it's a good question. All right, so Bava Batra is going to start off with the topic of partnerships. And this is going to get us into a lot of conversation about how we interact with other people. What is our responsibility to our neighbors? What is our responsibility to our partners? How does that work? Because as we know, love your neighbor as yourself is a wonderful principle. It's also really, really hard because the neighbor is the person you often have trouble with. The neighbor is the person whose tree is dropping fruit and who's building this and doing that, and your business partner even more so. Now, it's important to remember that the model of village life in the classical world at the time of the Mishnah is very different than the American model of farmers. Right? In America, when we think of farmers, we think of, let's imagine just like a road, and you have a little farm, and you have the field, and then you have another field, and there's a little farm, and then so on and so forth. Right? And maybe this is like 5 miles, between houses. Little house on the prairie, right? Little house on the prairie. They didn't have neighbors. Their neighbors were like an hour walk away, because America's got a lot of land, and America doesn't have or didn't have a whole lot of wild predatory animals. It didn't have rampaging bands of bandits, only occasionally. And so being isolated like this was fine. And oftentimes America, in the westward expansion, there were rules that said, if you can claim this much land, you can take it. Right? The land was free as long as you were willing to work it. So of course, people took tons of land and tried to make it their own. In the classical world, it was more that you had a village, sometimes even with a wall around it, and then you'd have fields around the village. And people would go out to the fields during the day to work, and then they'd come home into the village at night. And so everybody was a neighbor, and everybody had a field, and these fields would often be sort of like stuck together, and sometimes they'd be in like weird shapes, and that was just which piece was yours and which piece was your neighbor, and sometimes you'd have one piece here and you'd have another piece there. Things could be very, very complicated, and we're going to zoom in on the house a little bit later to look at a courtyard.
To cross any field.
Remember we talked about at the very end of the last one, if there was a known path to that piece of property, either for you and your ancestors or from the previous owner, you were allowed to keep using it. Like an easement, exactly. There was a presumed easement if there was a trail. If that trail disappears, no more presumption, get off my land. So that was how it was handled. So you've got all of these different little fields around, and sometimes you would get partnerships, which nowadays I know people think of partners as being like Ben and Jerry's, right? Business partners, and you were going in on this together. Sometimes you just had partnership of, hey, look, I've got my field, you've got your field. Let's share this field and we'll work on it together. Right? And then we'll share whatever we grow from it, and we'll do 60-40 or whatever was agreed in the terms. And maybe I've got one partnership with you on this, and I've got a partnership with this guy over here. The partnerships were much more small scale, and they might be just for 1 year or maybe for 2 years. The partnerships were not like we're building a company. They were just what was needed by whoever owned the piece of land at the time. So there were a lot more partnerships. And so the halakha about partnerships was something that everybody would use. It wasn't just for companies, and it wasn't just for business people. So hopefully with a little bit of that in mind, this first chapter especially is going to make a little more sense of what we're talking about. We good? All right, enough introduction. Bava Batra, Mishnah, chapter 1, Mishnah 1. We're going to start off with the zoomed in version, where we have, let me erase my little house on the prairie, where you have, too far, a courtyard. This was the standard way that you would build houses in most of the classical world. And you would build a house here, house there, house there, house there, and a house there. And there would be some sort of gate to come in. And this area would be empty. Make sense? But sometimes you would have another courtyard like this, and maybe this one opens over there, and maybe there is a house here and a house there, and maybe this area is empty. Right? So maybe this guy and this guy are going to share that. Right? Let's imagine, we'll make it even easier. There's only two people involved, right? So it's like that and like that. Maybe they're going to share it. The question becomes, how do they share it? Who has what right? Once you're sharing it, what happens if you want to change how you're sharing it? That's where we're working with. Good? Good. We're going to do a lot of diagrams tonight, I think. All right. On my left.
If two partners wish to make a partition in the courtyard, they build a wall in the middle.
Okay. Makes sense, right? We're going to start off with the simplest possible case. House A, house B, gate, and a wall, and there's a courtyard between them, right? Empty space in between them.
So that's tziburi or a street tziburi?
No, that's not a public area.
It's
right?
not public area.
No, that's owned by the owners of the houses, right? It's
No, but
private communal property.
no, but I know that it's not the topic, but for Shabbat.
Yeah. For Shabbat, that is a
No.
private domain. So you don't need an eruv. You can walk from here to there and carry things, no problem. Yes, exactly. Right. So that is Reshut HaYachid, a unified zone for them.
That part of the house.
Exactly. So if I'm in here and I want to walk out here with my food, no problem. If I want to go into his house with my food, no problem. Yeah, that's no problem. But that's Shabbat.
Yeah.
All right. So they've been living like this for a while. Now they decide, you know what? We need our own space. So the question becomes, where do you put the wall to divide the courtyard? And the default is, well, if they are equal partners, you make a wall down the middle, or as close as the rabbi can draw. So that becomes the new separation. And now one has this half and one has that half.
But what happens if the fruits are not equal? One has better quality of land than the other.
Oh, this is the courtyard. We're not talking.
Yeah.
This is the courtyard. We're not talking about farms yet. Right? This is a courtyard. So it's just an empty space between the houses.
What happens one has more sun than the other, or more shadow?
That's why you have halacha, so that you don't argue about those things. Right? You just divide it down the middle, like I Love Lucy. Right? Just draw a line down the center. Onward.
In a place where the custom is to build of unshaped stones, or of human stones, or of half bricks, or of whole bricks. So they should build it, everything is in accordance to local custom.
All right, so I'm sure you know your neighborhood. I'm sure your homeowner association knows your neighborhood, that there are certain styles for how to make fences. You follow the style. If you're going to build the wall out of just rocks, then you build walls out of rocks. If the wall is built out of stone, it's built out of stone. Now, why is this an issue? This is an issue because if one person, let's call him Mr. A, wants the fancy stone, and the other person, Mr. B, does not want to pay for the fancy stone, since they are splitting this cost, can Mr. A force Mr. B to pay for the fancy stone? Depends on the local custom. If the local custom is hewn, nice, smooth blocks, then yes, he can. He can force him to pay for half the price of smooth blocks. And Mr. B can't say, rubble is good enough. Nope. Mr. B cannot cheap out if the local custom says hewn stone.
Yeah, but if A want to buy and build something that's more fancy than the local custom,
Right.
A pay the difference.
Only if Mr. B is willing to agree to that.
If
Mr. B could say, no, you can't, he could stop him.
No, but what happens, let's say that, I don't know, the local custom is stone, okay?
Right.
And I say, you know what, stone, I don't want just stone. I want a little better than
What?
stone.
Marble.
Marble, yes. So B pay half of the price of the stone, and A pay the extra, the difference.
If they both agree. But if B says, I don't want marble at all,
But who can pay A?
he might not care. You're right. But if he does care for whatever reason, maybe the marble's too bright. Maybe the marble is too expensive to maintain. For whatever reason, he can say no because he owns half the wall. Okay, so with that in mind, let's go on to part A.
If the wall is made of unshaped stones, this one supplies from his property 3 handbreadths, and this one supplies from his property 3 handbreadths.
So what do you mean by supplies from his property? It means, I'll change color, that they actually give up a little bit of dirt on each side to build the wall on, right? Because walls take up space. So each have to give up, and it's not building the wall completely on B side, not building the wall completely on A side, it's down the middle. And it's 3 tefachim they have to give up. Now a tefach is the width of a hand. So this is generally thought to be about 3 to 4 inches. So we're in American terms, we're talking about a foot, that each one of them, so it's about a 2-foot wall, about that thick. That's how much they have to give up. Make sense?
Both.
Both give up 1 foot.
Yes.
And so the wall is 2 foot thick, but it's 1 foot on this guy and 1 foot on that guy's property. Good? Good. And remember, this is even if Mr. B didn't want to divide the courtyard. If Mr. A says, look, the partnership's over, I want to divide the courtyard, Mr. B has to go along with it. Because the ability to divide the courtyard is his right. That's what it means to be a partner.
Does it depend on how big the courtyard is, whether or not they can force them to divide it?
If it becomes unusable, yes. So if the courtyard was, this narrow, trying to put a wall down the middle, and now your door won't open, that would be a problem. But if there's room for it to still be usable as a thoroughfare, as a in and out, then yes, they can still force it, even if it's narrower than you want. All right, part B.
If the wall is made of hewn stones, this one supplies from his property 1.5 handbreadths, and this one supplies from his property 1.5 handbreadths.
All right, so if you're building this out of nice brick, you don't need as much territory, right? You don't need as much land, because if you're building out of uneven brick, like rocks, when you stack up the rocks, you need wider at the bottom, and then it gets a little bit narrower as it goes up, because you're sort of balancing them with a bit of mortar. But if they're nice, clean, cut blocks, then you can make it narrower, and the wall will still stand. Perfectly logical. Onward.
If the wall is made of half bricks, this one supplies from his property 2 handbreadths, and this one supplies from his property 2 handbreadths.
Same idea, just a different way of doing the bricks. And finally,
if the wall is made of whole bricks, this one supplies from his property 1.5 handbreadths, and this one supplies from his property 1.5 handbreadths.
Again, it's just trying to say you have to have a reasonable amount of footing for whatever type of wall you're having. You can't say we're going to build it double thick and you're going to pay for it. You build what is reasonable for that type of material, and that type of material is chosen by local custom. Good? Good. Hopefully you're going to find that a lot of Bava Batra makes a lot of sense. You may also find that if Bava Batra was followed by more neighbors, there wouldn't be as many arguments. All right. Chapter 1, Mishnah 2. Aaron?
The same is true with a garden. In a place where the custom is to build a fence, they can obligate him to do so.
Go ahead and read part A.
However, in a valley where it is not customary to build a fence, they cannot obligate him to do so.
All right, so now we're not talking about a courtyard. You have to adjust your scale. Now we're talking about a field, exactly. But we're still sort of talking about maybe like gardenish size rather than huge farm. But now they want to divide it into 2 different pieces. Well, sometimes people make fences between those. Like you imagine if you've ever seen like the little wooden planks that they lay down as, little fences across like the American Civil War battlefields. It's classic look, little cross pieces of wood with a bar on the top. That's perfectly fine if that's the normal thing. On the other hand, if it's not normal, you can't force the other guy to pay for it. And you can't force him even to have it unless he's willing to agree to it. Same thing if in the valley, oftentimes, usually perhaps, valleys don't have these fences, and therefore you're not allowed to put it in if that would be unusual. Make sense? Okay. Part 2. Aaron?
But if he wants to build a fence, he must gather into his own portion and build, and he puts a finishing on the outside of the wall.
Okay. So now we get into something that actually still is very relevant in American property law, which is, okay, so let's imagine you want to build this fence between you, but it's not normal to build a fence there. So Mr. B says, I don't want a fence, right? I don't want to share a fence. Mr. A says, okay, on my property, I want a fence. And so even though the real property is there, Mr. A has to build the fence only on his side. He can't go 1 inch onto Mr. B's property, but he can build a fence on his own property. He just can't build a fence on the other guy's property. And when he builds it, he has to make a nice finish on the part facing Mr. B. He can't leave an ugly wall that's open to Mr. B. Now this is, at least it was in California, because I remember there being arguments about this. And in California, if you build a fence on your property, the nice part of the fence has to face out. Right? You know how when you make like the planks kind of fence and then there's the bar across it, you have to put the bar on facing your house, not facing your neighbor. Right? Because your neighbor didn't ask to have an ugly side of a fence pointed at him. So it has to be towards you. Then some people try to get around it by doing those fences that go back and forth, and it looks good from both sides. But this style of fencing, you have to make sure there's a nice coating on the outside between you and your neighbor, and all of it has to be on your side of the line.
Okay, so none of this property was owned jointly, right? For joint use?
I mean, you could. I mean, but usually property was considered to be owned by just one person. And then you could work out an agreement with someone else. So even if you had, for example, 2 brothers, each one of them would have been given by their father a portion of the property. They wouldn't have owned the property together. They would have owned it separately. Now, could they combine? Could they buy property together? Yes, but they'd still be considered partners. And therefore, they could still liquidate their share. And we'll talk eventually about buying out your partner from a piece of property in order to either you buy it out or you sell it to him as a way of consolidating it into being one person's property alone. But hold on for that. All right.
So different than here. When my neighbor was a constructor and then he wanted to change the fence, he say, I pay all the fence, but I build the fence in your land, your side of the land.
Well, if you agree to it, that's fine. But you had said no. He wouldn't have the right to do it.
No, he didn't.
Right. Did you agree?
Of course not.
Oh, so that's basically what the argument is here. Although with part 2 here, or part 2A, you might have had a different idea. Aaron, part 2A?
Therefore, if the wall falls, the place and the stones belong to him.
Right? Because walls are going to fall from time to time. This is not, permanent construction. So if the wall falls and now you've got rocks, everywhere from the wall, he owns the wall, this guy, Mr. A. And wherever the wall was, that is his property. Now, you might be thinking, well, this is obvious, but that's because I drew this in 5 minutes. Imagine this was 50 years ago, right? You need to have long memory of who built the wall, whose land was the property on, what were the markers of the land, to know that when there's an earthquake 50 years later and the wall falls down, that Mr. A gets to collect all the stone and Mr. B better keep his hands off. Or Mr. B's son, or Mr. B's grandson. This was part of the ongoing issues. And again, remember the Mishnah was written for the court to make these decisions, so that when Mr. A takes Mr. B to court for stealing his bricks after the earthquake, the court will be able to say, well, who built the wall, where was it built, blah, 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 blah.
So would the finish be evidence that those are your bricks?
Not necessarily, because you could put finish even if it was built on joint land, if you both agreed to do it, or you only finished your side and he finished his side. You need to have witnesses, you need to have some level of history to know who owned what.
Because if it's, like you said, 50 or 70 years old, you're probably not going to have any witnesses.
Well, you might not have witnesses, you might have documents, you might have other indications like the marker is, between this tree and that tree, and therefore, since it was on this side of the property, we know it must have been built by my great-grandfather, not rather than jointly. They would use things like that.
What about if the fence was facing you?
Then you would have to have a more detailed examination of the circumstances. But yeah, this is why the rabbis, well, they didn't get paid big bucks. They didn't get paid really anything for doing this. This is why they would have the respect of the community to come through and examine this. A reminder for those of you who were not with us when we went through Sanhedrin, when you had a Beit Din, it had 3 people on it, and each person, Mr. A and Mr. B, would choose one of the judges they wanted to be, and then together the 2 judges would pick a 3rd judge. So that was how you would make a 3-person court that everybody would accept whatever decision they made. So they each got to pick their favorite rabbi, and then the 2 rabbis picked a 3rd person. That was their way of trying to make it fair. Good. Part 3.
If they acted with each other's consent, they should build the wall in the middle and put a finishing on both sides.
Right. If they're both agreeing to this, finish it up, try to make it obvious and clear that it was jointly done. Therefore,
if the wall falls, the place and the stones belong to them both.
Okay. And again, that way we know that it is a shared piece of property and shared materials that went into the property.
So 3/8 seems to imply that the fence does have some evidentiary value.
It does have some, but it's not conclusive in and of itself. So it would lean you to believe one way or the other. And that's why they're trying to remove any doubt by saying, finish it up on both sides. Chapter 1, Mishnah 3.
If a man has surrounded his fellow's land on 3 sides, and he fenced it on the first and the second and the third side, they do not obligate him to share in the cost.
Okay. So there's a couple different ways to understand this. Let's erase our village. We've got Mr. A, and we've got Mr. B. Mr. B has land all the way around Mr. A's territory, except for one side. We good so far? Okay. If Mr. B wants to build a fence, he can't force Mr. A to join into the cost. Okay? Now the question is, where is the fence? This is where there's 2 different interpretations. One interpretation, I'll switch over to red, says the fence is here, right? That it is a fence around B's territory. And the assumption of why you might have thought that A should foot the bill was because A is still benefiting, right? Whatever benefit the fence is giving, keeping animals out or whatever, well, A is getting some of that benefit because if they can't get through the fence to B, then they can't get through to A either. The other interpretation, do I have a different color? Maybe this one's different, was the fence was going to be there, that the fence was going to be just around A's. Again, there's still an assumption that A might prefer that there was a separation between him and B, but because it is only surrounding him on 3 sides, which might seem to be mostly to his benefit, it's not around the entirety of it. Therefore, he does not have to foot the bill. Make sense? Okay. However, over there.
Rabbi Yosef says, if he built a fence on the 4th side, they obligate him to share in all of the costs.
Okay, but if there was, make sure I'm getting my right pens, if B's territory was like that, and he put a fence all the way around it, now A has to pay for it.
But in the previous case with the green also he need to pay because he's protecting his territory 3/4.
Because it's dividing territory that was held as a partnership. So it's showing where it is now being separated into one side and the other. This is not necessarily saying they were partners. This is just neighbors. And so that's why we need a separate ruling and clarification for this.
But he has some advantage for the fence.
Of course.
So he needs to pay for it.
Well, and that's why Rabbi Yossi says if the fence goes all the way around A's territory, either the little version or the outer version, that A does have to pay half. But if it only goes around part of it, then A is not obligated to pay, even though he's getting some benefit. It's not clearly for his benefit, and therefore he can't be forced to pay. Again, remember, this is for the court. If you talk to your neighbor and you say, hey, I'm going to build a fence, I would really like if you shared some of the cost with me, and the fence is going to be around 3 sides, and that way you're getting some benefit too. It's okay for A and B to come to an agreement and shake hands and to share the cost. And if they do that with witnesses and people know that that's an agreement, then A does have to pay. But if B builds the fence and then shows up with the receipt and says, okay, pay, this is what we're going to want to ask. Does it cover all the property? Does it leave a side open? Does it not? Those are the questions that are going to be, and whose property was it built on, and things like that. You look like you got a question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry to keep doing this. To
No, wait. Questions are good.
Does this have anything to do with if there's only 3 sides, anybody can still enter the property, but if it's covered from all sides, then you're actually excluding people from the property?
I don't know it's necessarily exclusion as much as protection.
Right.
That a fence that has one side open is only kind of a fence. I mean, yes, it will stop, the occasional random animal that might have wandered in, and it may kind of stop the random person that might wander in. But there's still a big hole on one side.
Right. So anybody, if they want to get in, could get in.
Exactly. And you can imagine a situation. Let me just change my art a little bit, where B's property is like this. Again, back to our first draft, and B makes the fence exactly like that. So all of B's property is protected, except for the part around A. And he could even do this and then say, hey, A, I protected you on 3 sides, pay up. And A would say, no, right? There's still this big hole here that I'm not getting any benefit from. So no, I'm not going to pay. It's nice that you built a fence, and yes, I will enjoy some benefit from it because of the fence, but you can't force me to pay for that. If you talked to me about it, maybe before you built it, maybe I would have. Maybe I would have had some, willingness to compromise, but you can't just show up with a receipt. On the other hand, if B shows up, and again, his property, not in front of A, but remember his property was all the way here, B is allowed to build a fence all the way around his property. And after building it, he can show up with the receipt, and if A won't pay, he can take him to court.
Now, what topic if we also, let's say, built a fence in the last part?
All the way around.
No, the opening around A.
This one.
The blue one, the little blue one in the
Property.
Oh.
So if he does, then he is definitely wrong because B doesn't own this. So what are you doing building a fence there? Now, if B talks to A and says, hey, I've got the workmen coming to build a fence, would you like me to have them build it in front of you too? They can come to an agreement. Absolutely, no problem to make an arrangement like that. But if B just comes in the middle of the night and builds a fence in front of A's property and says, pay me, he's built on someone else's land.
Okay, let's say that he built around
The full version.
The full version.
Right. He owns the whole land that surrounds
so
it.
say,
Right.
pay me.
Right.
Now, I need to pay for all or only the area of the fence around his
He
land?
needs to pay for half of the whole fence.
But that's
Yes.
very unfair because most of the land is not part of king, it's protected more B. Why he doesn't need to pay the fence around his area? King can help, but why the other big? If let's say that B is a big landowner,
Right.
okay, has huge land,
Mm-hmm.
and A is a little one that
1 acre.
yes,
1 acre.
exactly, and yes, he built around everything, and he said, okay, now protect you. Why he need to pay for the whole land when he has only 1 acre?
Because that's the halacha. I mean, ultimately, this is the way that the rabbis decided it would be fair for people to be able to work together or not. Because how do you prevent B from building on his own property?
a kind of free meal for B. Like B take advantage of A.
It's potential. There's potential for that. Yes. Now again, good neighbors mean good discussions. B and A should have come to an agreement of, really, I don't think I should pay, and B can. But yes, you're right. If B owns all of that land, he does have the legal right to demand that payment because it is a fence that is protecting A's property.
Rabbi,
Yes.
if B builds a fence around 3 sides and A builds the 4th one, he's obligated to pay B, right?
No.
No?
No, if he builds it with his own money,
Connecting the 2 walls of B's?
B doesn't have to, well, whether or not they touch would be a question, right? If you're actually manipulating the other person's property, then we got another issue. Right? I can't nail my fence to your fence without permission. But if A builds on his property and B builds on his property, they each built on their own property. So that therefore it's fine. And likewise, if A already had a fence around his own property and then B builds another fence around his property, A doesn't have to foot the bill.
So in this case, for him, if he be praying like that, it would be much cheaper to build fast and fence around his property.
Depending upon the size, the relative size of the 2 fields. But again, the best thing is always have a conversation, right? Invite the person over, have a cup of coffee, talk about what fences you need for your property, figure out what's the best solution for your situation. And if it goes to the court, then they're going to be looking at the Mishnah to make their final judgment. Okay, we are on Mishnah 4. Flying through. I think we're up to you.
Mishnah 4. If the wall of the courtyard fell down, they obligate each of the partners to help in building it up to a height of 4 cubits.
Okay, so you got a wall. The wall goes through the courtyard. It's part of the communal, property zone, like we talked about at the very beginning, down the middle of the line. It was assumed to be built by both and all of that. The wall falls over. Mr. A can't say, you know what, we don't need a wall. Mr. B's like, hey, there was a wall. We're going to rebuild the wall. And the wall goes up to 4 cubits. A cubit is roughly about 18 inches from here to there. So we're looking at about 6 feet of wall. So they're able to force the other member of the courtyard to rebuild the wall and to pay for the expense if they're not going to do it themselves to get it back up to a 6-foot height. Because there was a wall, the wall needs to come back up.
6 feet high.
Mm-hmm.
And they
That's normal for fences in America too.
because it's a little over the average height of the person.
We're going to get to privacy, but yes. Yeah, walls are often about privacy in halakha. Okay, so part A.
He is presumed to have paid his share unless the other brings proof that he has not paid.
So this gets a little bit more tricky, but also into human nature. If 10 years later, B says, hey, A never paid me. And A says, yes, I did. The assumption is that A did pay. Right? If there's no proof, if there's no agreement that he did it, or A has a receipt, or there's no letters to the court saying A still hasn't paid me, A still hasn't paid me, A still hasn't paid me, then we assume that A pays, because that is the default, right? Default is partners in a courtyard will share in the building of the wall, they'll share the expenses, and they share the ownership of it. Therefore, if the wall is there, A must have paid it. And who would be so stupid as to build a wall without getting the other money from the other guy? Right? So the assumption is that the wall is jointly owned unless there is evidence to the contrary. Make sense? Okay, part 2.
The fence was built 4 cubits or higher. They do not obligate him to help in building it.
All right, so a wall is a wall if it's 4 cubits, about 6 foot tall. If Mr. B wants to build higher than 6 feet, he can't force Mr. A to pay for the additional height. He can only force him to pay up to the 6 foot level. Makes sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
Onward.
A. if the one who did not contribute built another wall near it, even if he did not put a roof upon it, they obligate him to share in all of the costs.
Okay, so I'm going to need another drawing. Okay, I did take drafting in high school, but I'm not really good without a T-square. All right, so we've got our two-person courtyard again, right? And they needed to build a wall, and let's imagine that that's the middle, and for whatever reason, A was not joining. A and B. All right, let's imagine that A was not joining in, and so he did not contribute for the building of the wall, or maybe it went higher than he wanted, and so he didn't want to pay for the additional elevation. So now we've got a wall which is basically B's property to some degree, either completely because it's built on his side, or it's higher than usual and therefore he paid for the extra. And then A comes along in green and says, you know, if I build my own wall here, I can put a roof. And now I've got a shed, right? As soon as he builds that wall, we make him pay for this wall, the half that he owes, right? Because if you're going to use that wall, then you are now part owner of it. And that means you've got to pay for its construction.
Including the height, that's
Whatever-
10 feet.
Whatever this wall is, you have to pay half of because you are intending to use it. Even if you haven't built a roof yet, you are still obligated just by putting down the bricks to now have to foot the bill for the rest of this wall because it's one half of your shed or whatever new room extension you're building. Remember, most people were home constructors back then. You didn't need to get the guy to come out and do the code regulate and all the regulations. You just threw rocks.
What's the difference between that and Mishnah 2, where A would not have to pay if he connected the fourth wall? If B built 3 of them.
That was a fence, not a wall.
A fence, yeah.
Right. Well, because a fence is not creating a usable space that you would then use as a room. But yes, if, to go back to a quick drawing, if we had our B and A, and this was a wall around A's territory, and then A builds a wall like that he's going to make a shed out of at the back, then yes, he automatically becomes obligated. As soon as you start using that other piece of property, even if you weren't obligated before, you are now. Because you've now made it your property, or at least you've made a stake in the property. And the rabbis did not want, as a general rule, for you to be able to say, that wall is his, but the shed is mine. It's like, no, if the shed is yours, then at least half the wall, the part on your side, is yours. That's how you avoid people getting into all sorts of other arguments later on. This may not be what Mr. B wants to hear or Mr. A wants to hear, but it's what's going to make Mr. A and Mr. B's grandkids much happier by having this be what it is. However, let's just get part where we're still in New York, right? Part B, to make sure that we get this other side to the story.
He is presumed not to have paid his share unless it brings proof that he had.
Right. So because the wall was built either at a non-standard height or on B's property, B, right? Mr. A is not thought to have paid yet unless he has a receipt. Because why would he have paid if it was done over there? Therefore, it's now the burden of proof on him to show that indeed he did pay for this wall or his portion of the wall that he is now going to be making use of.
Is there a limitation of time or anything like that that goes with it if he wants to build a shed?
No, not really. If he builds this wall and then 10 years later he wants to build a new wall to make a shed, you're going to be paying for what you're using.
Adjusted to the inflation or?
The Mishnah doesn't really go into inflationary issues. The some talks about currency and things like that, but in general, inflation wasn't a regular issue. They knew about price fluctuations for commodities. Grain is really expensive this week, but not next week, that kind of thing. But the idea that 1 dinar would be worth a lot less than a dinar in 50 years' time, that wasn't such a common occurrence. And that made sense because their currency was all pegged to a material standard and usually backed up by an empire that created very flat currency, which had its own problems. But yeah, that inflation was not such a big concern. It would be interesting to see, and I haven't looked as a modern situation of how you would adjust, because I know that we do often levy things that do take into account it should have been done 15 years ago and how it is done now. But the rabbis were very careful as well not to overdo that, because if you do it unwisely, then it's the equivalent of taking interest. And now you have another transgression. Now it's like I loaned him the wall for 5 years, and now I'm paying him back with interest for the use of the wall, and that is prohibited.
And that is about the cost. The problem is how
Like
you
I'm saying, it's not
today.
it's not
How you calculate it.
it's not impossible, but it has to be done very, very carefully to make sure that it doesn't have the hint of interest. Yeah. Okay, and now we're on Mishnah 5, flying through.
Number one, they compel a partner in a courtyard to contribute to the building of a gatehouse and a door for the courtyard.
Okay, so remember, we can actually reuse this. Remember how I said before we got into our just A and B courtyard, that most of the time you had courtyards where you would have multiple houses sharing the courtyard, sharing the empty space. And it'd be like a little condominium cluster, right? Because they were usually against each other. The walls were stuck together and all of that. And you've got an open here at the front of your little courtyard. You can, if you're part of this courtyard, say, we need a gate here. And once that gate is being built, everybody has to pay their share for the gate. Even if you say, I don't want a gate. Tough.
HOA. It's the idea of HOA.
Yeah, same idea as an HOA, yes. Right. Right. You're in a gated community, yes. And therefore, everybody in that community has to pay their share for building the gate. However, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel has a different idea.
The Rabbi Shimon ben Gamaliel said, not all courtyards are fit for a gatehouse.
Now, the halakha doesn't follow him, but his opinion was, look, there are courtyards and then there are courtyards, right? Some courtyards, you don't need to have a little house with a gate and, have somebody sitting there, watching the gate and seeing who's coming and going. Sometimes it's just, a shvach little, why do you need a gatehouse? But the halakha is, if they're going to build a gatehouse, everybody's going to contribute. You can't say, we don't need a gatehouse. It's part of the courtyard, you're paying.
What about only just gate? It's the same. If it's only just getting to pay.
As long as that is what the group has decided. But if the group wants to build a gatehouse, you've got to be footing the bill.
So what does mean the group means? The majority would happen if one person of the yard, courtyard decide one person, okay, I want to have there and get that everyone beneficial, because that's the goal. If everyone beneficial, you need to contribute.
Yes. If it's decided by one person that they're going to build a gate, then everybody else can be forced to participate in this.
Also, it's 10 say no and only 1 say yes.
Yes, as long as there's no loss from building this. If he says we're going to do this and that means we're going to tear up your house, then we got another problem. But if he's saying, look, I just moved in, but I'm looking around and I don't see a gate here, and I really think we need a gate in this courtyard, he is within his rights to force the other people to participate, right? Because protection was considered to be a fundamental right. And if I want to be protected, and you're going to benefit from that protection too, then you're going to pay for this. Now, just to give you another example, which we'll eventually come to, if I want to build a town wall, can I force you to pay for the town wall?
Yeah, because everyone benefit from protection.
Exactly right. So the community would be able to tax itself to build the town wall. Right? There are numerous things that the Talmud and the Mishnah and the Talmud then discusses that the community can tax itself, that it can force itself to pay for as a benefit to all of the members of the community. And one of them is a gatehouse, one of them is a town wall, another are teachers, things like that we are allowed to tax ourselves in order to provide these public goods.
How come they don't go by the general rule with go with the majority though?
Because you don't have to wait for the majority to tell you something is needed. If the majority say we don't need it, but you think we do, if it is something that is a default option, then you go with the default. The same way that if the bricks, you don't have to have a majority of people voting of what type of bricks. It's what's the local custom. If the local custom is brick, then we're doing brick. Even if you don't want brick, if I'm in that courtyard and I want to go by local custom, we're going to go by the local custom. And if we all agree to go by a non-local custom, that is okay. But by, we're going to build it regardless, then we have to follow the custom.
So if the town has a wall, they can force the courtyard to build the wall too, one person?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the courtyard is its own private domain. It's not protected just because there's a town wall.
So anything that improves the courtyard or around the wall?
Not anything.
No, but I mean, this kind of stuff.
Yes.
Everyone needs to pay exactly the same amount.
That's a whole nother conversation. So when it comes to town walls, there's a whole long discussion about those who are closest to the wall pay more than those who are farther from the wall, and if you're a resident and if you're not a resident. We'll get to that eventually.
So it's not about the income, it's about where do you live exactly geographically.
Correct. There are other types of what we call progressive taxation, where depending upon how much you make, that's how much you pay. But there are other types that are use tax, like a toll road, right? If you use it, you pay this much. If you use it more, you pay more. And there are both types of taxes within the Jewish system.
These courtyards, they're not always private, are they?
But what do you mean by private?
You can carry in them and stuff?
Yeah, usually, yes.
I thought I remember reading in Shabbat, it kept talking about how the courtyard you could not carry without the air roof.
So there are ways you can build a courtyard, like if you deliberately left the front open so that, it was not a marked space and there was no lintel or bar or anything over the top of the courtyard, then yes, the public domain oozes into the courtyard itself. But most courtyards were a semi-private in the modern sense of the word and a private domain in the Shabbat sense of the term, because it was simply more convenient to do it that way. You wanted to build your courtyard so that it was a bit enclosed and just for you and the members of the area. That was sort of the default.
So like these gated communities, you could carry in Shabbat?
I'd have to look at the individual community. So potentially, yes, if there was a wall all the way around, then yes, and you set up an eruv with another neighbor to set up the food in their house or vice versa.
You need the eruv then.
Well, an eruv is not just the space. An eruv is also an act of intention to commingle that space. So if you don't do the act of intention to commingle the space, then you just happen to be living behind a wall.
Yeah.
It's just in most big eruvim, the individual doesn't need to do that. That's being taken care of by whoever maintains the eruv.
I think that you didn't need an eruv to carry in the courtyard though, right?
No, an eruv would happen automatically within the community. Neighbors were closer then. Having a pack of food in the other person's house in order to set up your own private eruv within the courtyard, it's easy. And then that was something that neighbors would have just done, like, hi, welcome to the neighborhood. By the way, we have an eruv. It's that people knew their neighbors.
So naturally, the old city of Jerusalem is one area, one private area. So
Yes.
you can transport whatever you want in Shabbat.
Correct. The Jewish community of Jerusalem does maintain an eruv in the old city, and I believe
Just for the wars, no?
but I believe there are also extended eruvim outside the old city as well, that have been created with wires and cables and all of that. And if we do eruv next, then we can talk about that.
Talk about the walls. So say any big city with a wall around
Is an easy eruv.
is a natural eruv.
Yes, exactly.
Question. If this is the same like in the book of Nehemiah, that talk about the building
Yes.
and the family assigned to each.
Yes. So in Nehemiah, they talk a lot about the cities and the building. They also talk a lot about Shabbat and people who were trying to bring things in on Shabbat and how they had to shut the gate so that they would stop doing that and things like that. So yes, you can see a sort of real world example 2,000 years ago of what that looked like in practice. Yes. Okay. And we are now on Mishnah 5. We're still on Mishnah 5. Sorry, part 2. There we are.
They compel a resident of the town to contribute to the building of a wall for the town and double doors and a vault.
Right? So yes, as we talked about, if you're building a wall, everyone has to pay. And you, even for the gate and the bar, you put across the gate to make it a wall, to make it a strong gate. Part A.
Rabbi Shimon ben Gamaliel said, not every town is built for a wall.
Again, he loses the ultimate argument, but he wants to say, yeah, not every town needs a wall. But if you're going to build a wall, you are going to pay according to halakha. Part 3.
How long must a man dwell in a town to count as one of the men of the town?
All right, so this is a good question. If I'm just there for the night, I'm in a hotel, and they come around and say, hey, we're building a wall around the town, pay up. What? No, you have to be there for a minimum length of time. How long is that? Part A.
12 months.
12 months, exactly. So if you're living in town as a renter for 12 months, then you are part of that town, and therefore you do have to pay. If it's less than 12 months, you're not going to be charged the wall tax yet.
It's I have association with the conversions.
Mhm.
That's here, that you need to pass all the holidays to be part of the community.
Right.
So maybe that's
And that's not officially a law. And
No,
that's just good practice. But yes, exactly. All right. And then part B is if not for the renter.
If he has purchased a dwelling place, he immediately counts as one of the men of the town.
All right. So if you're renting, you're here for 12 months. If you buy a house or an apartment inside the town, you're one of us. And you're going to be paying, right? Because ownership of that property makes you part of the town.
Also, if you don't live, you rent.
Hmm?
Also, if you don't live, you rent.
If you own the property, but you rent it to someone else,
Yes,
the owner still has to pay, as does the renter after a year.
I know.
The renter as well would also pay after he had lived there for a year. Because the renter physically is benefiting from the wall, right? It's not only protecting the house, it's protecting the people. And I know in America we focus on our property more than the people, but it's the people that are being counted. All right, last one in chapter 1. Wow, I think we're going to get a nice full chapter done tonight.
All right, so Mishnah 6.
Yep.
They do not divide a courtyard until there is 4 cubits for this partner and 4 cubits for this partner.
Okay, so we talked about this a little bit before at the very end of Ketubot, but there is a similar theme going on here. And in my little diagram that we talked about, I didn't really give you a scale, but what they're trying to say is, we sort of touched on this, if the courtyard is like just the size of this empty space between the tables, we're not dividing this, right? Because if you put a wall down the middle of this, you're not going to have 6 foot over here and 6 foot over here. And that means you've made the area too small. And so it cannot be divided. Again, if they choose and they agree to divide it and it's, all the witnesses and everything, then yes, they can. But one person can't say, I want to divide this and force another person to pay for the wall. Make sense? Okay.
So the minimum needs to be 12 feet.
It would need to be 12 foot across, yes. 8 cubits, 8 amot.
Even counting the foot on one side and foot on the other?
Yeah, it has to be the amount of usable space has to be 4. So yes, I guess if the wall is going to be a thick wall, then you're going to need a little bit more room to cover 4 wall and 4.
So it has to be a livable space of 4 cubits.
4 cubits plus the wall width, exactly.
If they don't have that much space,
Mhm.
is this considered joint property where anyone can walk on either side of the property?
Yes.
Or is there still there's no dividing line?
There's no dividing line, right? So the courtyard was like communal property. And in fact, when we get into chapter 2, we're going to talk a lot about what can you do in the courtyard and how much will that bug me, the neighbor, right?
So if you had like in that one with 4 houses,
Right?
they would have to have 24 feet, right? Or no?
Each person would have to be left with 4, because it's not always a perfect shape, but each person would have to be left with, and of course, a way to get out. You couldn't put a wall around their house and you're trapped. You'd still have to have an exit. All right, that was part 1. Part 2 is now going to be talking about fields.
Nor do they divide up a field until it has 9 calves for this partner and 9 calves for this.
All right, so a kav is an interesting term because a kav is not a measure of distance. A kav is a measure of volume. And it's basically 9 kavim is the amount of seed that you would use for that field, right? So how much seed is this? How much seed is this? And this is debated. I read one that said this was like about like half an acre or something like that, but some do more, some say less, but it's a good chunk of land. So if you have a field that's the size of this room, you can't separate this field because then it becomes too small to really use, right? You're not going to get your ox to turn around in that field and all of that. So you would just have to still share the space, and you get your half and I get my half, but the field would remain separate property, but you wouldn't be allowed to put a wall in the middle of it because the edges would not be usable by the two owners. Rabbi Yehuda says?
Rabbi Yehuda says until it has nine half caps for this partner and 9 half caps for this partner.
All right, so he had a slightly different measurement, but the dominant voice wins, 9 kavim. Part 3.
Okay. Nor do they divide a garden until it has a half cap for this partner and a half cap for this partner.
All right, so gardens were more of the small plots of land that would be either in the village or right next to the village. So you'd have your big wheat field, and then you have your vegetables. And the vegetables, you didn't plant, miles worth of vegetables. You could grow a couple pumpkins easy, but that Halloween, so I'm thinking of pumpkins. So that amount of space, you don't need as much. Make sense? Okay. Rabbi Akiva says you can even use less.
A quarter cap.
Yeah, small little spot, no problem. In England, we call those allotments. Number 4.
Number 4. Nor do they divide up an eating hall, a watchtower, a dovecote, a cloak.
I mean cloak, like actual like clothing.
Okay, a bathhouse, or another press until there is sufficient for this partner. Sufficient for this one.
Right? So, okay, let's say you have a joint watchtower. Well, what's half a watchtower? Right? Well, if it's big enough for me to be on my side and you to be on your side, okay. But if you cut it in half and now I've got like nowhere to stand, then you can't divide that. Same thing for, a little thing for doves to fly into. If it's a piece on my side that's big enough for doves to come and go, and a piece on your side that's big enough for the doves to come and go, no problem. But if you divide it in half and now it's too small for any doves, then you've ruined it. So now we're not sharing it, now we're just breaking it. So it has to be big enough that it could still be used for what it was intended, which is what they're going to talk about in part 5. Exactly this. They're going to actually do a general klal, a general rule on number 5. Yes. So number 5.
This is general rule. Whatever can be divided and still be called the same name, they can divide. Otherwise, they do not divide.
Right. So that's the general rule. If you take your, what were some of the other ones? If you take your bathhouse and you cut it in half and there's no room for a bath anymore, then it's not a bathhouse. And you can't cut it that small. And if you try to, then you are in violation, and the guy could take you to court and they'd make you take down the wall and you'd have to go back to the way it was. Because it has to still be usable for whatever it was before the division took place. That's the general rule. Make sense? It is very logical. Part 6, however, is going to give us a little qualifier.
When is this so? When they do not both wish to divide the property.
This is when there is one person who is a holdout, who is reluctant, who is saying, no, I don't want to divide the property. However, part A.
However, if both wish they both wish, they can divide it, even if it's smaller.
But if you both want to cut your bathhouse in half, and it won't be a bathhouse anymore because it's too small, if you both say yes, cut away and use it for whatever you want to use it. But if it was a bathhouse first, and one person wants to cut it, and the other guy says, I don't want to cut it, you can't cut it. Good? Excellent, right? And then part B, a great way to finish.
In regards to sacred books, they may not divide, even if they're both.
Right? So if you become partners in owning a Torah, you are not allowed to cut the Torah in half and say, that's your half and this is my half. The Torah has, or any sacred book, any part from the rest of Tanakh, has to remain whole. I should point out, however, for most of this period, most books were written on a single scroll, and they were one book at a time. So you'd have a book of Bereshit, you'd have a book of Shemot, you'd have a book of Joshua, and it would just be a scroll that was just that one book. Much like we now see, much like we only see now when it comes for Megillat Esther. Right? There's few examples where we get to see only one book per scroll, but that was the way that all the books were handled in the ancient world. It's just one scroll, one book, and you can't cut that in half. Make sense? All right. It's 8:00. I'm not sure we want to start chapter 2, because chapter 2 is about your. The classic phrase is, "Where does my right become your harm?" Right? Where do I get to do what I want to do with my property, my stuff, without hurting you? And that is still one of the biggest arguments in modern life. If I want to take up taxidermy, and have a bunch of dead animals in my backyard, and I'm skinning them and I'm leaving the meat out, and is that okay? It's my property. Right? But if you're next door and you're like, that's an issue. Actually, a real case before we go, in Australia, like Arizona. In Australia, there was a case that came before the court of a vegan who was complaining that her neighbors were deliberately having barbecues to make the smell because they knew that it would bother her. So she lost. But she was deeply hurt by, I can't use my backyard, the smell is everywhere, and I can't stand the smell of them cooking the meat. But of course, they are allowed to use their backyard to cook meat. That is considered a reasonable use of your own property. So we're going to go into a whole bunch of questions of what's reasonable and not reasonable for using your own property in chapter 2.
Just in my house in Pennsylvania, and my neighbor was not a neighbor, and inside our house, we had a place where we put our barbecue place.
Right.
Inside of our yard.
Oh, in your property,
and
right.
He decided to put an umbrella, chair, table, and umbrella, and the umbrella go on the top of my barbecue.
Right.
And he kept threatening me and saying, "You burn my umbrella." And I called my husband, and my husband told me, "You don't talk to my wife, you talk to me, and I hope it burns."
You leave it there, it's my property, it's not burn. Hey, you know what the drill is.
We will cover those issues. In chapter 2, we were going to talk about what happens if my property damages your property when your property's on my property. Yes. So
We spoke about that before.
in one of the other Bavas, yeah. So as you notice, 2,000 years later, we still have neighbors, right? Well, and 2,000 years later, we also still have good neighbors, right? There are lots of good neighbors that will join together, make good decisions, build things that are very nice, make a park for the kids, or have some, joint play area, or share a vegetable garden. Even today, people still do these things. But the bad neighbors are the ones we remember most.
That neighbor, I have to say, in the end years, he changed and he cooperated. He moved his umbrella.
Oh, it's nice.
It was nice.
So maybe there was something that was really bad in his life when he was causing trouble.
Yeah.
And this is the way he was acting out. Exactly. It happens. It happens. But the law protects us from when people do things. Right? That's the whole idea of good neighbor, bad neighbor, friendly neighbor, angry neighbor. Ultimately, what is legal and what is not legal. Right? Because when it ends up in the court, the judge will have to make a decision not based on whether the person is nice or whether the person is mean, but make a decision based on the law. And that's why we have the law. But we should be nice. All right. Take care, everyone. Yes.
On an off topic, when you have the air